Alright, it's April 1st when I'm uploading this video, otherwise known as April Fools. So I was thinking to myself, what would be a fun video for April Fools? What would be a change of pace from my usual content? After a bit of thinking, it came to me. How about an alternate history video? The Revolution and Napoleonic periods are both rich areas for alternate history possibilities. From there, it didn't take long to strike upon a topic that I feel will be quite popular amongst those who watch my content. The title of the video has already spoiled what I settled on somewhat, so without further ado, I'm happy to present Before we begin, a few things to note. I'm going to try and keep this as realistic as possible, but history does have a way of coming up with events that sound like fiction. So while I will be sticking to a main timeline that keeps Poland as an independent country, I will on occasion point out alternate ways events could easily have turned. My scenario will also end with the start of the First World War, for two reasons. Firstly, because by that time events will have become different enough that accurately predicting what could happen becomes much more difficult. And secondly, because similar to the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars, the First World War is a conflict that completely reshapes Europe. With all that out of the way, we can begin with possibly the most important question for this alternate history scenario. Poland was an ally of France during the Napoleonic Wars, partly due to the great influence Napoleon held over the then Duchy of Warsaw, but also due to the fact that the Poles viewed Russia, Prussia, and Austria as enemies due to their partitioning of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Now, to have a Polish state survive the Napoleonic Wars by no means requires a French victory. That would inevitably make this a video centered around what if Napoleon won. So for this timeline, the Napoleonic Wars will end the exact same way, with Napoleon's defeat in 1815 and the victorious powers of Europe creating the new European order. The Congress of Vienna provides the perfect point at which history can diverge and we can create our independent Poland. During the Congress of Vienna, the question of what should be done with Poland and Saxony created a crisis that nearly led to another Europe-wide war. To greatly simplify the amount of diplomatic maneuvering that took place, Prussia wanted Saxony, and Russia, led by Tsar Alexander, demanded all of Poland. Austria, Britain, and France viewed Russia claiming all of Poland as unacceptable, and Austria desired an independent Saxony. The representatives of each side signaled that they were willing to go to war with the issue, but the crisis was eventually solved peacefully. A deal was struck where Prussia would receive over half of Saxony, part of Poland, namely what would become the Grand Duchy of Posen, while the rest of Poland would be given a liberal constitution and placed into a personal union with the Tsar of Russia. On paper, at least, Poland was made independent, but that independence was steadily eroded before it completely collapsed with the failed Polish uprising in 1830. This crisis gives us the wiggle room to create an alternate scenario, where Poland becomes both independent and free from Russian influence. While Tsar Alexander is by far the central figure of the crisis due to his insistence on claiming Poland, and Russia's military might, Prussia's where I feel an alternate solution to the crisis can be found. Prussia was much more willing to accept compromise during the Congress of Vienna than Russia, as highlighted by its willingness to accept only part of Saxony and its willingness to give up much of its former claims over Poland in exchange for more land in the Rhineland. It is not inconceivable then that Prussia might have been willing to back the creation of an independent Poland and accept less than the total annexation of Saxony if it was given more land elsewhere in Germany. With the risk of another war being a real possibility, Austria, France, and Britain would present the idea to Prussia so as to isolate Russia in case of war. Tsar Alexander might have been aggressive in his demands and willing to start a war, but with most of Europe against him, he would nevertheless be forced to accept a compromise that left most of his desires unfulfilled. In this timeline, the crisis ends with the following changes. Prussia still receives everything it did historically, but in exchange for supporting the creation of an independent Poland, it receives expanded territories in the Rhineland. Russia only receives a small part of the Duchy of Warsaw, creating a lasting grudge between Russia and the newly created Kingdom of Poland. The creation of an independent Kingdom of Poland with a strong liberal constitution, in part thanks to the British, creates a new dynamic in Eastern Europe, as it would be a rare constitutional monarchy. To deny any nation carving up Poland again, Prussia, Austria, and Russia would informally agree to support Poland should one of the others invade. In reality, Russia would continue to desire the full annexation of Poland that had been denied to them during the Congress of Vienna. Prussia's attention would mainly be focused on the rest of Germany, but it would support an independent and neutral Poland for the time being, so as to deny Russia or Austria any advantage. Austria, interestingly, becomes most supportive of the now independent Poland, due to its diplomatic nature and the fact that it has other areas to focus on. After the Congress of Vienna, the British interest in Poland mostly ended, while the French were too consumed with rebuilding to really concern itself with Poland, at least initially. Poland would therefore find itself in an awkward balancing act, where it had to avoid antagonizing its neighbors so as to avoid another partition, while at the same time attempting to completely rebuild itself, including its independence from outside powers. To that end, it would have varying levels of success. With the new kingdom's independence would come a challenging time, as it was even smaller than the Duchy of Warsaw that had come before it. Forced to rebuild yet again, Poland would have several factors going in its favor. First and foremost, the fact that it was actually truly independent. Unlike even during the Napoleonic Wars, where it was obliged to build a strong military for Napoleon's wars at the cost of its own economy, it could now prioritize its own interests. Secondly, despite the loss of a large amount of territory yet again, it would still control much of the Polish heartland, and the great mineral wealth contained there. Finally, Poland's new military would be full of former Napoleonic officers and soldiers, allowing it a measure of security as it rebuilt. During this time, the Kingdom of Poland would be relatively secure externally, due to all of Europe rebuilding itself, but internal divisions could pose a more serious threat. Depending on who is placed on the Polish throne, a conflict could arise between those who supported the Constitution and those who supported a stronger king. For the sake of this scenario, however, whoever the king ends up being, he will be Polish, without major connections to any other European power, and will be satisfied enough with his position to not create serious internal divisions. This is a pattern that would continue in subsequent kings. The country had been lost once, and escaped the collapse of Napoleon's empire by the skin of its teeth. So I think it's safe to say that most would strive not to open the country up to major internal weaknesses, lest it be exploited by their neighbors yet again. Where I could see possible disagreement, however, is in which European power the new Poland would favor for lasting protection. After 1815, it would simply be a fact that the now relatively small Kingdom of Poland would be unable to defeat any of its neighbors in a one-on-one conflict. It would therefore try to avoid invasion as much as it could, but with three great powers on its doorstep, Poland would need to find allies should war break out. As long as Tsar Alexander was alive, Russia would be out of the question as a possible ally, and even with his death in 1825, most in Poland would be against any alliance with Russia. Prussia would also be similarly impalpable for many in Poland, due to their annexation of a large chunk of the former Duchy of Warsaw, and their participation in all three of the partitions of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. That would leave only two realistic options for the Kingdom of Poland to ally itself to: Austria and France. France would be the most obvious option due to the connections formed during the Napoleonic Wars and the favorable feelings many would most likely hold towards the country. Despite this, however, a large obstacle to any alliance between France and Poland at this time would be the liberal and constitutional nature of the Kingdom of Poland. France's restored monarchy would be very hesitant to ally itself with such a government, fearing such ideas would spread back to France. Indeed, the very existence of such a liberal and constitutional monarchy would provide an example for liberals throughout Europe to point towards as what was possible. Add on top of this the distance between the two countries and the fact that France was recovering from its heavy losses, an alliance would be unlikely for the time being, leaving Austria as the only realistic choice left. Now, Austria did have several things going for it in terms of allying with the Kingdom of Poland. It benefited the least from the partitioning of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, only managing to keep hold of the territory it secured during the first partition, and not even participating in the second, unlike Poland's two other neighbors. During the War of the Fifth Coalition, Austrian forces sent to secure the Duchy of Warsaw were defeated by almost solely Polish forces, possibly proving to some in Austria that the new Kingdom of Poland could be a valuable military ally. Finally, Austria was locked into a grand strategic game against Prussia and to a lesser extent Russia, as it tried to limit their growing power. Even with the loss of Poland, Russia would be a rising power in Europe, much like Prussia. Austria, meanwhile, would be slowly in decline. Those favoring an alliance with Austria would therefore win out in the Polish government, with the two countries growing closer diplomatically. How close is hard to say, as there would be risk of Poland angering Russia, and especially Prussia, if it grew too aligned with Austria. Now that's not to say that there would be no other obstacles to a Polish-Austrian alliance, namely the large number of Poles in Austria that would likely wish to rejoin their country. A liberal Poland next to Austria could also serve to further antagonize liberal elements inside of Austria that the government would certainly oppose as the main defender of the new European order. Both of these factors could grow in importance over time. Now relatively secure on a strategic level, the Kingdom of Poland would slowly rebuild itself economically, initially with great difficulty due to its economy's reliance on agriculture and the poor state of the peasants at the time. Slowly, however, things would improve, as during the 1820s, Poland's great natural wealth in areas such as coal would serve it well. Even still, agriculture would continue to play an important role in the Polish economy, with the plight of peasants posing a risk to the stability of the nation if left unaddressed for too long. The first major test for the Kingdom of Poland would come in 1830 as part of the wider European instability that came with a wave of revolutions throughout the continent. Reactionary pushback against these often liberal revolutions, and liberal groups more generally, would likely hurt Poland diplomatically, as it would be viewed as a rallying point for such ideas. The perceived threat that Poland posed as a rallying point for liberals could result in pressure from its neighbors to crack down on such groups, and the souring of the Polish-Austrian alliance. This shakeup would also provide an opportunity, however, as a combination of worsening relations with its neighbors and the revolution in France could open up a renewed push in the Polish government for closer ties with the French. Ultimately, for the time being at least, the status quo for Poland is held. Neither Russia or Prussia make serious moves against the Kingdom of Poland. Despite its concerns, Austria too would maintain the status quo, viewing the military and strategic importance of Poland as worth the risk of a continued alliance. The status quo could not last forever, though, as another European crisis would redefine Poland's strategic positioning. During this period, the Kingdom of Poland would continue to expand economically and, barring any unexpected catastrophes, would be doing relatively well for itself. It would not be without internal issues. Politics and conflict between peasants, the growing working class, and the old upper class would all be present, but could be managed. Two growing trends during this period, however, would work against Poland, eventually leading to a uniquely Polish crisis in 1848, as its strategic position would be shattered by the wider springtime of nations. The first major factor working against Poland would be the large Polish populations left beyond its borders, in Russia, Austria, and especially Prussia. While Russia would already be hostile to Poland after the Congress of Vienna, and Austria would be more friendly due to Poland's value as an ally, relations with Prussia would only sour over time. Having large Polish populations that would like to rejoin the Polish state would serve to antagonize governments to crack down on these minorities and try to assimilate them into their own countries. Austria might offer some concessions or considerations to its Polish population, but Prussia would crack down and increasingly view its Polish neighbor as a threat. With Prussia turning against it, Poland would be pushed even further into a reliance on Austria for security. The second factor that would increasingly work against Poland was its liberal nature. While internally this would be beneficial, as unlike many other countries, Poland would experience less internal instability, externally Poland's liberal nature would serve as a liability. Rising nationalism and liberalism movements throughout Europe would likely draw strength from Poland and use its borders as a safe haven in an often hostile continent. Pressure would likely be put on the Polish government to crack down on any such group, especially from Prussia and Austria, but the Polish government would likely be against restricting such groups. What effect Poland's existence would have on the scale of the wider revolutions in 1848 is hard to say, but its fate would almost certainly be tied to how events played out. Nearly all of Europe would experience instability or revolution of some sort in 1814. Two notable exceptions, however, would be Russia and Poland. Austria, meanwhile, would be the hardest hit, as Hungarians and other ethnic minorities in the empire would revolt, with the only way for Austria's survival being outside help. It's here that Poland's story would be most likely to end. Russia, just as in our timeline, would agree to intervene, but its price would likely be Austria's assurance that they would not intervene if Russia moved to invade Poland after putting down the Hungarians. Prussia, dealing with its own problems, would be unlikely to intervene or seriously oppose such a move. How events take place and in what order, however, would seriously matter, and could provide a narrow path for Poland's survival. I see two main paths that events could follow during 1848. The first, in which Poland stays neutral despite Polish uprisings in both Austria and Prussia, would see Poland eventually invaded by Russia after the failure of the Hungarian Revolution. While the Polish army would most certainly put up a fight, defeat would be almost inevitable, as even in the best case scenario where they won enough battles to put Russia on the back foot, Russia would simply draw upon more troops while leaning on either Austria or Prussia for assistance. In the second, much more interesting path, however, Poland would see itself much more deeply involved in Austria's crisis, quite possibly leading to a wider European war. When revolution first began to sweep Europe in 1848, the Polish government would have to make a critical choice, whether to support the revolutionaries, many of whom would hold the Polish state in high regard, or to keep to themselves to try and maintain Poland's delicate status quo. In this scenario, seeing the unique opportunity to act while most of its neighbors were consumed by internal instability, Poland would side with the revolutionaries throughout Europe. Of particular interest would be the inevitable Polish uprisings in Prussia and Austria that Poland would support diplomatically, materially, and eventually militarily. Upon the toppling of the monarchy in Paris, a renewed push by many influential figures in the Polish government would see Poland form very friendly relations with the various French governments that would follow. It would also be quietly supporting Polish separatist movements in both Prussia and Austria as they developed. The outbreak of the Hungarian Revolution, however, would be the turning point, as seeing the catastrophic state the Austrian Empire was in, and being implored by Hungarian representatives, Poland would seize the moment to reclaim Galicia, while at the same time supporting the Hungarians. Austria would then go to the Russians for support, who would intervene against both the Polish and the Hungarians. Prussia would stay neutral as it dealt with its own problems throughout Germany, with the exception of putting down a Polish revolt. How such a war would turn out on the battlefields of Hungary and Poland I cannot say for certain, but the Poles and Hungarians would likely hold an early advantage. Russia would take time to mobilize its forces, and its attention would be split between the Hungarians and Poles, while Austria would lose many of its initial battles, being forced completely out of Hungary and losing control of much of Galicia to the Poles. By this time, however, the tide would begin to turn as Russian armies marched into Poland and Hungary. Poland would be forced to devote much of its attention to defending its territory from the Russians, while Hungarian forces would be stuck in a two-front struggle. At this point, Polish and Austrian forces would likely avoid major combat with each other as they devoted their attention to their respective fronts. Should the war go on long enough, Prussia would eventually stabilize itself and threaten intervention on the side of the Austrians, viewing them as a necessary part of Europe and angry at Poland over the failed Polish uprising. The only way out for Poland from this disastrous situation would be outside interference, and help would come from the French. France at this point would still be dealing with its own internal troubles, as its government would change frequently during the period, but in comparison to the other parts of Europe, it would be relatively well off. While it would stand by initially during the war in the East, as the tide began to turn against the Poles and Hungarians, it would step into the conflict, threatening intervention should Prussia join the struggle, and offering to mediate between Austria, Poland, and Russia. France would insert itself as a key player in how the struggle would end. Austria would be willing to negotiate, as it was in a horrible state and at great risk of collapse if the conflict carried on, even if their combined might with Russia would eventually crush the Hungarians. Poland too would be willing to negotiate a settlement, as it held a relatively strong negotiating position, controlling all of Polish Galicia, and having been able to hold the Russians off for the most part up until now. Russia, however, would be the largest question mark, as if they wished to continue the war, damn the consequences, they very well could. Seeing Austria near collapse, the risk of an even wider European war, and their own relatively strong negotiating position, Russia too would agree to negotiate a settlement after some convincing. The Hungarians too would agree to negotiate, having seen the tide turn against them and fearing ultimate defeat. Going into the treaty negotiations, each side would have its own objectives, with France largely acting as a mediator, having kept Prussia out of the conflict. Poland would desire the territories of Galicia that it had captured. Austria wanted to maintain the unity of its empire. Hungary desired full independence, while Russia was concerned with the stability of Austria, containing Poland, and with extracting something for all the resources it had put into the conflict. It would not take long for representatives from both sides to realize that almost everyone could gain a relatively satisfactory deal, with the exception of the Hungarians. Though the Kingdom of Poland had initially joined the conflict in part to help the Hungarian revolutionaries, concerns with its own interests would take precedent during the negotiations. The Hungarians, sadly, would be left to their own devices, and would have almost no say in how the treaty turned out, eventually storming out of the negotiations when they realized the rest of those present cared little for what the Hungarians had to say. In the final treaty, the following terms would be agreed to by all sides, minus the Hungarians who were no longer part of negotiations. Number 1. Austrian territorial integrity, including Hungarian lands, would be recognized by all parties, with the exception of Galicia. Number 2. Galicia would be split between Poland and Russia, with the Kingdom of Poland receiving all majority Polish lands, while the Empire of Russia would receive the rest as payment from Austria for its involvement. Number 3. Poland would pay Austria the equivalent of 5 million Austrian guldens, roughly $400 million today. Very notably, Hungary's absence from the final treaty would spell its doom. While Hungarian forces would be able to reorganize themselves somewhat during the little over a month it took for the negotiations to conclude, the freed up Russian forces that had been fighting Poland and the similarly reorganized Austrian forces would succeed in putting down the Hungarian Revolution. Poland, however, had survived, and even managed to gain territory that had not held since the first partition. The cost, however, in essentially betraying Austria, one of the few states that was friendly to it, would be dangerous, not fully replaced even by its newfound friendship and tentative alliance with France. Austria would be severely weakened by the war in 1848, and even more by the loss of Galicia. Recovery would be possible, but it'd be a slow and long process that Austria might not be able to afford. A far more important result, as far as the Kingdom of Poland would be concerned, would be its newly isolated status in Eastern Europe. Both Russia and Austria would now be hostile, with Prussia indifferent to Poland at best. The only factor likely saving Poland from yet another partition would be its close relationship with France, and the fact that its neighbors all had other concerns drawing away their attention. A silver lining would even emerge from this situation, in that Poland would have very little reason to get drawn into the inevitable Austro-Prussian War for dominance over Germany. As for the Austro-Prussian War itself, it might very well take place several years earlier due to Austria's weakened state, but the end result would be practically the same. Prussia would form the North German Confederation and dominate German politics from that point onwards. Austria would be forced to compromise with the Hungarians and form Austria-Hungary. Soon after, the Franco-Prussian War would erupt and end in a crushing Prussian victory that would allow the creation of the German Empire. Poland would wisely stay out of the Franco-Prussian War, seeing how effective Prussian forces decimated Austrian and other allied armies during the Austro-Prussian War. Though Poland's neutrality might hurt its relationship with France for a time, strategic and at this point long-standing cultural reasons would allow both countries to put aside most differences for mutual cooperation. Overall, what position would this leave Poland in? If Germany wanted to, it could very likely propose another partition of Poland with Russia and Austria, bringing the countries closer together and eliminating a possible enemy to its east. Bismarck would almost certainly push for such an action to cement his alliance of the three emperors, Russia, Austria, and Germany. An alternative path could exist, however, if Poland was instead used as a buffer between Germany and Russia. To Germany's west, France shared a relatively small border with Germany, limiting France's ability to strike at Germany should war ever occur. If a similar situation were created in the east by using Poland as essentially a shield for Russia, Germany could benefit. Caught between empires, Poland would have no choice but to accept such a position, and might even do so somewhat willingly, as it was no friend of Russia. The years would therefore go by mostly peacefully for Poland, with improved relations with both Germany and France, and gradually improving relations with Austria-Hungary. Things would not be perfect, as they never are for any country. Polish populations in Germany would serve as an irritant to relations between the two, but overall, Poland would continue to grow peacefully and even prosperous as an industrial hub of the East. That would all end, however, with the outbreak of World War I in 1914, a struggle of titanic proportions that would reshape all of Europe, including Poland. How the conflict would unfold, what side Poland would join, and ultimately who would emerge victorious, I will leave for those watching the video to theorize on themselves. Thank you everyone who watched the entire video and made it this far. This video is quite unlike any other videos I've made up to this point, and I hope you enjoyed it. I'd be interested in hearing what others think about the scenario I created, as there were a number of different directions I could have taken things. Let me know in the comments section what you think, and if you enjoyed the video. Please subscribe, it would help out my channel a ton, and thank you again for watching.